I'm just soaking up this breeze, smoking on some trees, smoking on this weed. Yeah, this is all I need.
Welcome everyone to Emerald Live monthly educational series. I'm Jill Cohen, Managing Director of Emerald Live. Today is National Voters Registration Day, so our discussion on legalization and compliance couldn't have been more timely. Be sure to register to vote and vote yes on legalizing adult use marijuana if you're in New Jersey. Before we begin, I would like to pay tribute to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I want to share my gratitude for her being a leading voice for gender equality, women's interests, and civil rights and liberties. She was a true inspiration. She will be sorely missed. May she rest in peace. I'd like to thank our partners, Heady, New Jersey, The Last Prisoner Project, Garden State Normal, Cannabis Voters Project, Tribe Totes, and Fairmue. We will ask questions throughout the discussion where we can fit it in. Please put your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We will encourage you to network in the chat room, paste your LinkedIn profile and social media handles. We'll post ours, so please follow us. I'm really excited about this panel discussion today. 2020 may mark the emergence of the U.S. cannabis industry as an economic driver and job creator, and could be one of the most important and positive progressions of this era. The legalization of cannabis at the state level is picking up steam with states like South Dakota, Montana, Arizona, and New Jersey. Hey, New Jersey, that's where I'm sitting in right now. And all of these states are voting on adult use referendums on November 3rd. New Jersey is perceived to be the trigger for New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Rhode Island to adopt similar measures. Let's hope so. So now it's time for industry news from Jimmy Young, Pro-Cannabis Media, and followed by his word will be Christina DiGiovanni, our CEO of Emerald Media Group, and then we'll get the panel started. Thank you. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jimmy Young, the founder of Pro-Cannabis Media and co-host of We Talk News, a weekly news video produced and distributed on cannabis.net and our PCM social media network that now includes the Emerald Media Group. One more day, one more step towards adult use sales of cannabis in the Green Mountain state of Vermont. Now, you would think that the state that is the home of Ben & Jerry's and the cult rock group Phish and the former Red Sox spaceman pitcher Bill Lee would have legalized weed by now, and they did. But now the House and the Senate there has taken the next step and approved the opening of retail sales and the process for adult use of cannabis in Vermont. The bill passed their House last week, and today the Senate approved it 23-6. It now goes to Governor Phil Scott's desk to sign, and even though he has not disclosed whether he intends to sign it into law or not, everyone involved in this movement in Vermont is expecting that to be a formality. So not only will weed be for sale in Vermont, you can now possess up to 2 ounces, and the bill also expunges the records of past low-level cannabis possession offenses. Laura Subin is the executive director of the Vermont Coalition to Regulate Cannabis, and she said, quote, "We view this as a critical component of movement towards racial justice and cannabis policy. It recognizes and aims and repairs some of the horrific legacy of racism and enforcement of cannabis prohibition laws." Over the past month now, in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., well, they were all set to vote on the MORE Act. Now, that MORE Act would have legalized cannabis, okay, federally, but it got postponed until after the election in November. Now that climate in Washington, D.C. has gotten even more stormy since the passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg over this past weekend. Nice tribute, Jill. There's also another item out of D.C. over the past month that is a positive development for cannabis advocates, but again, the only movement seems to be limited to the House of Representatives. There is a bill now that will allow medical marijuana research to include dispensary-grade cannabis in legal states. Right now, the only federally accepted research is limited to the University of Mississippi, and their weed, not so good, or so I've heard. All right, now, another news item out of Washington, D.C. from the marijuana moment is that there is now a coalition of cannabis advocacy businesses who are trying to legalize interstate cannabis sales among legal states. the Alliance for Sensible Markets campaign is pushing governors of legal states to enter into an interstate compact. Now, before the lawyers get involved with this, a constitutionally recognized agreement between two or more states can establish a framework for cannabis to be transported and marketed across state lines. This interstate compact is similar to the agreement that created the Port Authority of New York in 1921, and it could open interstate commerce between New York and New Jersey, as well as California and Oregon, as soon as New Jersey passes it and makes it a legal deal. Now, personally, I'll believe all of this when I see it or hear about it, but it's deals like this that can start to bolster the economy after the election in November. And as Jill reminded us, today is National Register to Vote Day in the US. And I even got a tweet from the original drummer of the Grateful Dead, Bill Kreutzmann, who reminded me to go out and register to vote. Trust me, Bill, it's in the mail. I got it covered. And I can one day maybe even share that story when I got to hang out with Bill and his friends in the 80s in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. But for now, that's the news for the Emerald Media Group. I'm Jimmy Young for Pro Cannabis Media. Remember, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Use it responsibly. Back to you, Jill, and your panel of guests, and it's a good one. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. I always love hearing the news from you. Thank you, everyone who is joining us today. I'm Christina, CEO of Emerald Media Group, and I want to welcome everyone here. I also want to remind everyone to vote as well. I would love to introduce, first and foremost, our host, our moderator for the evening, Gary Weinstein. Gary is a Senior Vice President, Deputy General Counsel, and Chief Privacy Officer at a national consumer financial services company, and served as an Assistant Attorney General in Eliot Spitzer's Antitrust Bureau at the New York State Office of the Attorney General. Gary now serves on the advisory board advising cannabis companies. He recently filed a Friends of the Court brief in the Supreme Court of the United States as counsel of record for the Last Prisoner Project in a landmark case of cannabis to deschedule marijuana. Gary also serves on the International Cannabis Bar Association Legislative Advisement Committee. We are so lucky to have him. And before I hand the mic over, I just want to invite anyone who's looking for additional marketing services to consider Emerald Media. Our programmatic marketplace reaches the eyeballs of up to 240 million legal-age consumers on compliant platforms. Without further ado, Mr. Weinstein.
Thank you very much, Christina. Really appreciate it. And thanks to Jill for putting on this incredible panel presentation. I'm excited that we have so many people joining us. Let's dive right in. So as we've all been following closely in the news, and for those in the industry experiencing it directly, this industry is fighting to succeed with one hand tied behind its back. That difficulty is created in part by inconsistency between the branches of our federal government and contradictions between the federal government and state governments to clarify the legal status of marijuana. The objective with our time today is to share some of the thinking about how this industry can address these challenges. We do have some lawyers on the panel, and I'll get to introducing them in a second. But for an administrative matter, I hope you'll tolerate this one little disclaimer that what the lawyers say on the call today should not be construed as legal advice, and it's only with a legal agreement that a lawyer can provide advice to anyone on this call. So with that in mind, let me turn to our esteemed panel. Sheri Tarr is a compliance and regulatory strategist. As a former pharmaceutical marketing executive and after a career litigating against Big Pharma, she founded 68 Partners to help cannabis businesses and life science companies bring safe and life-enhancing products to market. She's an expert in working with brands to implement best compliance practices and develop regulatory and commercial strategies that drive revenue. Sheri serves as Director and Regulatory Committee Co-Chair of New York City Cannabis Industry Association and is a newly appointed Director of New Jersey-based Cannabis Advisory Group. Turning to Amol Sinha, he is the Executive Director of the ACLU of New Jersey and has led the organization since 2017. Prior to joining the ACLU-NJ, Amol was a policy advocate with the Innocence Project and a lawyer and advocate with the New York Civil Liberties Union. His career has focused primarily on racial justice, immigrants' rights, and reforming the criminal legal system. At the ACLU-NJ, he has prioritized ending cannabis prohibition as a civil rights issue. Bill Caruso is a partner at the Archer law firm, and he is an expert in cannabis law and government affairs. He served nearly 5 years as the executive director of the New Jersey Assembly Majority Office in Trenton, New Jersey. Prior to taking the Assembly post, he served for more than 11 years as Chief of Staff for United States Representative Andrews. He has twice been named by PolitickerNJ.com to the political news site's power list of New Jersey's most influential political and policy players. And finally, Dan Ulloa is a writer who covered politics and policy before a career in cannabis. He is currently the editor of Heady NJ, a local news site covering cannabis reform and the industry in New Jersey. Dan is also vice president of communications for the Latino Action Network, which he represents on New Jersey's pro-cannabis ballot campaign, NJ Can 2020. And he is the author of the book, Cannabis 101. So let's get into our panel discussion. I'll turn first to Sheri Tarr. Sheri, despite federal illegality, a majority of states have legal medical marijuana, and a fair number of states have legal adult use marijuana. And of course, more state legalization is on the way. So all is good, and successful legislation works for constituents seamlessly, right?
Depends on who you ask, right? So if you're getting at how the complex and confusing matrix of state product to market and to grow your business, is that the essence of your question?
That's exactly it.
Yeah, so it's an excellent question, and you know, it brings up the important message here that, and before I get there, I speaking of messaging, I'm going to speak in the spirit of RBG, who speaks on the level. And I need to shout out to her because she actually was quite an inspiration for me as a woman coming up in pharma. And when she was appointed, I was an executive in pharma in doing marketing, and to see her be appointed inspired me to actually make a pivot to law, and then go on this decades-long journey of trying to bring safe and life-changing products to market. So it is a segue back to your question. The opportunity that this conflicting state regulatory and local patchwork of laws and regulations and emerging regulations, it actually presents an opportunity. It's challenging, but it presents an opportunity for brands now to recognize that, number one, this is not a DIY. This is not something that you do alone on a weekend project. This is not cookie cutter. When you think about branding, when you think about commercialization, when you think about compliance, think about it in the context of building brand equity. And the fastest and most sustainable route to brand equity and investment dollars is to build and market a product that is trustworthy, that delivers value consistently. And how do you deliver trust? How do you engender trust? You put out a product that's consistent, that's compliant, and that delivers value in a safe way. So the opportunity that this, if you will, contradiction presents is for brands to recognize that they can get the right people, the right processes, the right procedures in place, and evaluate their brand and market their brand and build their business and apply for that license, not in a vacuum, but with consideration for this matrix of laws and regulations, and also what their brand vision is, what their risk tolerance is, what their financial runway is.
Well, that's much appreciated, Sheri. And the, you know, the question was actually poking fun a little bit because, as we all know, nothing in this industry is seamless. And I think you helped us introduce that concept. But I'd like to turn to Bill Caruso, if I could. and just ask directly, how does this federal-state contradiction impact businesses from a compliance perspective? And how can businesses successfully navigate the patchwork of state-level regulations?
Well, and I'm going to drop government in there for a second too, because it's chaos in some ways, but it works. I mean, local governments have a tremendous ability to stop and prevent cannabis companies from locating in their jurisdictions because of the prohibition at the federal level. And we'll come back to that in a second. But what has happened here on a proactive side, on a good side, is it's allowed these laboratories state by state to develop. And it really is, I mean, from a conservative standpoint, a state's rights, you know, sort of pot of gold right now. The states have tremendous ability to develop their own markets here and set their own rules. And the industry is really forced to work there. And that's been difficult. It's been difficult from a regulatory standpoint where, you know, a lot of these multi-state operators are forced to develop a set of principles or a set of operating procedures and a rubric that's, you know, different from state to state and makes this uniformity difficult. But it really has allowed, I think, a lot of creative efforts. And it has allowed the culture change that we've all seen, because, you know, there's some of us that have been doing this for a very long time, and we've seen this, you know, sort of glacial change. And then, you know, from like 2014 to now, it's just been like this in terms of what is happening from a regulatory and a statutory change perspective. The problem we have, though, still to this day, is companies that aren't in the cannabis space still are loath to get in this space. So hospitals would love to be involved in utilizing cannabis for medical treatment, but they just can't because it's so much risk associated with it. We've talked a little bit offline about the insurance industry. And, you know, the insurance industry for a long time was some of the biggest opponents of legalization and medical expansion. And now we see them as some of the biggest cheerleaders down in Congress trying to get some of these broken laws fixed so they can use cannabis for treatment purposes. And we've seen this even in my world, in the legal world, where the interaction that law firms played in the cannabis space was defending their clients that had been jammed up from a criminal aspect. Law firms now are advising on a variety of different levels, whether it's a land use application or it's a cannabis company that wants some HR and labor law advice and counsel, or frankly, some of these other companies now, banks and engineering firms and other types of companies, landlords that want advice and counsel on how to stay safe in this business. We're seeing a lot of positive interactions still because of this differentiation between where the federal and state laws are.
Yeah, no, great point, and really appreciate that perspective. You know, there may be companies out there that are not necessarily in the cannabis space. Do you have any examples of how companies that are not traditionally thought of, or they might not even think of themselves as part of the growth, the potential growth story of this industry, how they might interact and interface and become part of this industry movement?
Two anecdotes real quick, and I'll give you one. The insurance one, I spoke with the Insurance Council of New Jersey. I was one of their guests a couple years ago, and the panel was basically a setup. It was myself and one other advocate, and the rest of the people were just, you know, sort of Debbie Downers. No one was on board. And by the time we got done, we had general counsels of major insurance companies coming up to us and going, we really need to rethink this. We should be in this game. We should be figuring out. But the more interesting one, and again, another negative, I did a panel discussion where a guy came up and grabbed me after, and he goes, you're peddling death, basically. And I said, well, let's agree to disagree. But I asked him, what do you do for a living? He goes, I run a manufacturing company. I can't have a bunch of high employees on my assembly line. This is going to be a disaster for me. It's going to be the ruination of our economy. And I said, well, what do you manufacture? He manufactures high-end specialty plastic bags, you know, for oversimplification. I said, well, tell me more about this product. Oh, well, we do high-end bags for major electronic companies. And I said, well, like, do they have like Ziplocs on them? Or are they like safety? Yeah, all that. Really, really high-end stuff. I said, you ever think about being a vendor for one of these cannabis companies when they come into New Jersey? This is basically what they look for. And the guy looked at me and he goes, really? Do you think I could get into that business? And it totally changed his tune. So there's a market here for folks. And I think when you talk to them on their level and you explain what this really is going to be, there's a lot of things for a lot of people. We talk about advocacy. We talk about the disparate treatment, particularly with our Black and brown brothers and sisters, and how they've been treated. There's a lot of conversation going on in government about the need for revenue, jobs, and the economy. But the jobs and the economy piece is the place I like to dig into, because that's the great equalizer. That's the place where you can get the curmudgeon-y person that's not necessarily down with cannabis legalization, but they start to realize this is good for our economy, because it's going on right now. We have a cannabis economy. It's just a dark black market cannabis economy that we're not reaping any benefit from, and we're not regulating. And I think that's the change that occurs with people's head, as they realize, oh my goodness, we could be taxing, we could be regulating, and frankly, I could be expanding my business by working with these companies.
That's great. And thank you for the segue point. This is a perfect opportunity to turn to Amol Sinha, because Bill, you touched on racial justice, and I'm very interested in, Amol, you bringing us up to date on the efforts in New Jersey to push forward with state legalization for adult use. And obviously, because there are many people on this call and Zoom webinar that are not from New Jersey, and today happens to be National Voter Registration Day, as Christina and Jill mentioned, I think it would be especially helpful is, as you update us with New Jersey's efforts, to also address the larger connection between marijuana legalization and racial justice.
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Gary, and to EmeraldLIVE for having me. So, you know, it's been a long time coming in New Jersey. For the past 6 years or so, you know, Bill and Dan and others and I have been working together to try to get marijuana legalization through legislation. We had been talking about this from a racial justice perspective from the get-go. So back in 2014, when the ACLU with Bill and NAACP and a number of organizations came together to create a coalition called New Jersey United for Marijuana Reform, we were looking to bring legalization through legislation from a racial and social justice perspective. And what that meant for us was repairing the damage of the war on drugs. In New Jersey, you're 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession if you're Black than if you're white. We make over 32,000 arrests for marijuana possession annually, and that number has kept creeping up over the past decade. We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars every single year processing these arrests. And really the collateral consequences of an arrest are limitless. Folks lose opportunities in education. They lose economic opportunities. They lose their jobs. If you have immigration issues, you may lose your immigration status. You may lose custody of your children. Forget about becoming a teacher. You know, like, these are things that have real consequences on people's lives. And, you know, we are disproportionately burdening Black and brown folks and people that can't afford the best legal defense in order to get their records cleared. So we wanted to see a bill that could address not just the economic impact and creating a new industry and all the good that comes with that, but also repair the harms that we've caused over decades of prohibition. And we got to a place last year with a bill that we thought, as stakeholders and as folks in the government thought was a good bill. It did all of the things, or most of the things, that we wanted it to do. It expunged people's records. It created opportunities for a diverse and inclusive industry. It put tax revenue in the hands of localities that needed it. And you know, we wanted to make sure that people who wanted to participate in the marketplace, whether or not they were millionaires or backed by corporate entities, had a meaningful opportunity to do so. And you know, we got to a point where the legislature decided that it didn't have the votes to get it through, and decided to punt it to the November 2020 election. So now we are creating we have a ballot question where voters will get to decide whether or not New Jersey gets to legalize marijuana. And for the folks who are not from New Jersey, and even those who are from New Jersey, this was news to me. In New Jersey, we don't use ballot questions the way most states do. What we do is we use the ballot question process to amend our constitution. So in New Jersey, we have a very short question for marijuana legalization, and it's on the state website. You can look it up. And it leads to an amendment to the Constitution that's about a sentence long that you can read on the state website as well. And you can go to njcan2020.org and read it there as well. And the question will amend the Constitution. It will create a regulated product called cannabis, and then the regulations have to come from the legislature. And so it's a multi-step process here in New Jersey, but the first step is obviously to get people to vote yes. So we've created a coalition of advocacy organizations like the ACLU and NAACP and Latino Action Network and others, political advisors and awesome people like Bill Caruso, and folks from the industry, folks from the medical profession, doctors, prosecutors, labor unions, et cetera, coming together with common purpose to vote yes and get an overwhelming yes vote for marijuana legalization through racial, social justice messaging and economic justice messaging, which I'll just add, go hand in hand. You can't have racial justice without economic justice and vice versa.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Let me probe at that just for a little bit. So, and this may be relevant for other states too that are developing legislation to be signed into law. And once legislation is signed into law in New Jersey, that's a magic wand, right? Companies, people, they'll be able to immediately go on their merry way to sell, buy, and possess marijuana immediately, right?
So I note the humor in your question, Gary. I want to just sort of backtrack a little bit to what happens on November 3rd when everybody votes yes. November 3rd, everybody votes yes. That doesn't mean that possession is legalized. It doesn't mean that cannabis is legalized. What it means is that the opportunity to do so exists. What would be a grave injustice if on November 4th, we continue to make arrests as a state. And we have the potential to do so. And there's a lot of potential for confusion. And then, if we have legalization legislation lined up and ready to go, there's then a timeline for when marijuana can be fully legalized and purchased and possessed. And so what we need to do is do some public education around this. And I think it would behoove the legislature and the state to get ahead of this and to tell folks that we are thinking about legislation. We are thinking about your rights. We don't want to see a world where we're continuing to make arrests, even though the overwhelming majority of New Jerseyans believe that marijuana should be legalized and voted so on November 3rd. And we're going to fast track the process to get the legislature aligned and get legislation effective so that we can have an industry that works and people's lives can move forward without the burdens of those collateral consequences burdening them.
Very good. So turning to Dan. Dan, you're privileged to cover the industry as a reporter. What are you seeing on the ground as opportunities for individuals to become involved and address some of these challenges?
In terms of getting involved as a business or as an advocate, and so as an advocate, yeah, there's plenty of opportunities to get involved. Obviously, NJ can 2020, but if you're part of an organization already, community organization dealing with local issues, perhaps the more the merrier. It's always great to see if your organization would be willing to endorse cannabis reform, join our coalition. For example, there's always different ways, and obviously, as Amol was saying, implementation is really going to be the big question. Fall and perhaps next year, whenever that gets done. So we definitely need all the more people to show that it really does need to get done quickly. Because we've had all these serious issues, and a great issue that needs to be legalized.
Right. By the way, I will ask everyone who's on this conference to feel free to put a question in the Q&A. We will certainly get to that. That's the whole purpose of panel discussions, so that you can have questions answered. And we do have a group that will be able to field those quite well. My next question, though, is a toss-up between Bill and Sheri for their expertise. Maybe we could have Bill start since Sheri kicked this off. And my question is, until we achieve federal legalization, this industry may be possibly characterized as being held up by duct tape. at least from a legal perspective. So, of course, every day, CEOs, boards, and companies are engaged in practical risk discussions and calculations with their own counsel. Are there steps cannabis businesses and brands can take to decrease exposure?
Certainly. And I think where we are today, I mean, literally where we sit right now, the Congress potentially working on initiatives to fix some of these broken systems, it's now a question of when. It's no longer if. So I think most companies that were doing backflips, particularly in their banking transactions and other things, or trying to set up, personnel companies, right? Because you could shelter the sort of personnel piece of the operation and isolate the touching of the plant piece of the business. That's almost becoming passé at this point, because I think folks are planning for post-November. We're planning in New Jersey for some big things post-November, but I think the world is planning for some things post-November, regardless of the outcome at the federal level, for some significant changes. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of the backflips that are going on in the industry and that have been going on, and frankly have been hurting the ability to grow this industry, because it's wasted efforts to just do silly things because of the lack of clarity at the federal level. Mm-hmm. And that said, I can tell you, we're light years away from where we were when, we started in Colorado and other places. And this is only, as Amol said, we're like 6 years into this. It's almost been light speed if you think about it from a legislative standpoint. We were at a standpoint where we were wondering what was going to happen when the Trump administration came in, and were they going to upend all of the systems that we had in place for legalized adult use cannabis, and for even the medical plan? Were U.S. attorneys going to come in and start prosecuting these companies? The answer is, of course they're not. We're so far down the field now. So I think we're in a really good place, and I think we're moving the ball forward. I don't have a prognostication of when the feds are going to roll out their own, adult use sort of plan, but we're in that glide path. And so I think companies are doing less trying to plan around that now, and really starting to hit the gas pedal on trying to be in these new markets.
Thank you. Sheri, what do you think?
I think this discussion about a lack of clarity and uncertainty about, can you all hear me? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody? Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Sorry about that. So it seems to be freezing up on my end. So as I started to say, the hyperbole around the uncertainty and the lack of clarity, I think that sets up a false conundrum. The FDA hasn't radically changed its stripes in over 80 years, and it's not deviated too dramatically from its core purpose, which is to protect public health. So that is to say that we can learn a lot from the last 8 decades, and a lot from what's happened with the oversight of the pharmaceutical industry, which basically, I'm proud to have been a lawyer. I'm proud of the decade that I spent in the courtroom, but I'm a recovering lawyer. So I get to go a little bit outside of the box here and offer somewhat of a prediction. I think that the FDA will not deviate too dramatically from how it has operated in the last decades, and also how it is operated with respect to oversight of the cannabis industry. I think that they've signaled where the puck is going and what those regulations, when they are formally clarified, whenever that happens, will be. But the truth of the matter is they're already showing us what their intentions are. And no brand, no responsible cannabis business needs to wait for any regulator in order to be responsible, to be professional, and to be adults in this industry. Frankly, I think that in addition to advocacy, in addition to data, in addition to infusions of finances, I think that nothing will move the market and change minds, including those of regulators, better than responsible conduct that demonstrates that we know how to do this. We are committed to putting safe products on the market and complying with regulations that are already in place. And I'll just say, with respect to how do you move forward and sort of some best practices right now, to the extent that there is some black ice and that there is some uncertainty and there is lack of clarity and there is some confusion. You know, this is not an industry. Branding in a highly regulated space like this is not for the weak at heart. It is not something that you do cookie cutter. It is not something that you do in a vacuum or you're on your own. Get your best position players in place. Arrogance is not an excuse. It's not an adequate substitute for expertise. Bring in people that can help you to launch your brand responsibly, build your business so that you develop brand equity for your consumers and your investors. And, you know, quite frankly, it's just good for the industry, it's good for the brand, and it's good for business. So I'm optimistic because I don't think that there's as much confusion, certainly with respect to FDA and FTC, as people say. It's just hard to do it. But I can tell you that it's harder to clean up the mess created by being an irresponsible marketer, the mess created to your brand, than to just balance the risk, make reasonable decisions, and bring on the people that you need to bring on to help guide you to a successful result.
That's helpful. Amol, do you have a strong opinion on this topic?
We're talking about federal and state, you know, sort of lack of clarity. Yeah, you know, I think, you know, whenever there are reasons to not do something, people are not going to do that thing. And I think we've got, you know, plenty of consensus around the country that there is a trend towards legalizing cannabis. A plurality, if not a majority of Americans, I think it's something like 61% or something like that of Americans believe in legalizations. 66% of New Jerseyans believe in legalization. And in fact, 72% of New Jerseyans believe that cannabis should be taxed and regulated, even if they don't necessarily want to, even if they don't believe, they say they don't believe in legalization for whatever reason. There's a lot of support there. And I think it would behoove the federal government to do the right thing and pass the ability for states to do as they please, and for interstate commerce to happen. I think that we're just leaving cash on the table if we don't.
Thank you. Dan, anything else you're seeing on the ground here or that you're writing about that you'd like to share?
There's lots of things I'm writing about. You know, we have a dynamic state as much as we can. Right now, the medical marijuana program in New Jersey is growing with leaps and bounds. You know, obviously it's not where we want to be, and you know, it's a real shame, unfortunately, that it has been stalled so long that it was begrudgingly implemented under Christie, and you know, we would like to have, you know, 24 licenses distributed by now, and there's a large lawsuit, unfortunately, because of that. Held up because of COVID. So, you know, there's a lot of, it's interesting though, but cannabis is essential. So, because of COVID. So, there's interesting side effects because of that. So, you know, it really is like a fascinating, dynamic industry to cover, and, you know, a lot of great advocates here as well. So, and it's something that will only grow, you know, here in New Jersey. You know, we never had like a great like cannabis culture like California, where we've always had very strong drug laws here in New Jersey, quite unfortunately. And you know, we're seeing the negative effects of that. You know, given like implementation of cannabis reform, you know, in 2 years, you know, this is gonna be a very booming thing. You know, ideally there'll be like at least 100 dispensaries. You know, many small business licenses. You know. The issue of home grow, you know, people want to grow their own. It's difficult, but, you know, we're making progress on that. We had a state senator recently endorse that, so that's a little progress there. So, you know, we're making leaps and bounds. So, you know, things look bad in the short term, you know, long term, you know, things are a little sunnier.
Well, thank you for that perspective. I'd like to turn to Bill Caruso. you know, Bill, I think there may be a point of confusion out there about the difference between decriminalization or decrim and legalization. And I'd love to hear your take on the difference. And then maybe you could speak to which states have gotten the approach right. You know, as we here in New Jersey are looking to build out adult use marijuana with our successful ballot resolution that will be coming, which we will know very soon. It'd be helpful to have your perspective on which states should we go to school on, to use the vernacular.
So I'm going to roll in a couple of things. First of all, I don't think any states nailed it. I think there's good examples throughout each of the states where they've done really good things. And I hope Jersey's going to be that laboratory that kind of takes that hodgepodge. I'm 100% Italian. We make sauce on the weekends, right? We put a lot of different secret ingredients in. So we're going to pull from a lot of different states and make this sauce.
Isn't it called gravy though? No,
it is not.
No.
That
Okay.
is absolutely false. No, we call it sauce.
Very good.
But I like where we're headed, and I like the fact that we're not first. I like the fact that we are going to learn from some of the mistakes that Colorado and California and folks on the West Coast have made and other jurisdictions. And I think we're going to take from them some of their lessons learned and some of the positive attributes of these laws. But let's go back to your first question, because that's an important one about the differentiation between decrim and legalization. And I'll add into where they actually fit together. I think a couple of years ago, decrim was a noble prospect in the absence of legalization that we should have pushed for it. But I was never for just decrim because I thought we left too much on the table. And now we're so far down the field, decrim alone is really a waste of time and probably moves us back. And I'll say what I mean, because that's a little controversial. Decrim is a component of legalization. We need to decriminalize the possession of cannabis. We need to decriminalize cannabis in general. That way, if you're caught outside of the scope of the rubric that's set up from the industry standpoint, this is akin to, you know, having, bathtub gin or something like that. You're not going to go to jail for the rest of your life any longer. You're going to get a fine or something to that effect. That's what decrim means for me. But the problem with decrim exacerbates, and decrim done badly really exacerbates a lot of the issues we've been fighting on the racial and social justice aspect. Something I learned, and I am a government guy transitioned to the lobbyist lawyer front, but I love working with my advocate friends because I learn from them. And I've learned from my black and brown, particularly advocate friends, that any interaction with law enforcement is a bad situation. It is not a good outcome, particularly for a black and brown person. Well, decrim still invites those interactions. And more so, it invites a financial penalty that a person that doesn't have means may not be able to afford, and then they find themselves back in the criminal justice system. Bad decrim couples mandatory drug treatment, which is fun, right? Somebody like me, I get jammed up for, using cannabis. I go to court. I throw myself on the mercy of the court. I go to drug treatment that I pay for on my own after paying a lofty fine. And I get a certificate after watching a film, and I'm cured of my marijuana addiction. And I go back to the court and everything's fine. And I probably paid out $1,000, a couple thousand in fines, maybe an attorney, and I'm back on my life, right? Well, what happens if you can't afford that? Guess what? You're in the criminal justice system now. So we've looked at decrim alone and also put into perspective, Amol, I think, eloquently outlined, we're looking to take the revenue generated from legalization and put it back into communities and put it back into state government for positive efforts. Well, decrim doesn't come with any revenue. Decrim just continues to exacerbate the black market. You have an issue with teens getting access to it? Well, decrim doesn't solve that either. So we think that legalization is a much more comprehensive approach, and legalization coupled with a decriminalization component, for example, for folks under 21, we don't want to encourage teen use, but we don't want to lock them up either. So decriminalization has a place in this discussion and this debate, and it's a welcome one, but it belongs alongside the legalization discussion.
Thank you.
Can I just underscore something that Bill said?
Please do, Amol.
I think Bill did a great job of highlighting why Decrim isn't the full answer. I just wanted to point out that in this moment that we're in, where we're just grappling with the role of police in American society and thinking about racial justice in real critical ways. You know, you go down the street in New Jersey, in any white suburban town, and on weekends there are Black Lives Matter protests, and that's a fairly new phenomenon, at least at this sustained level. And you know, what Decrim does, as Bill mentioned, is that it continues police interactions with people. I think people are really coming to a conclusion that we need to limit unnecessary police interactions, especially with Black and brown people, because so often they result in terrible and tragic outcomes. And the reason why Decrim isn't the full solution is because while laying it out there, sorry if this insults anybody's intelligence, while I am able to possess marijuana without criminal penalty, I still may get a violation as a result of possessing marijuana. And the Decrim is usually silent on the ability for one to buy marijuana, for one to sell marijuana, and for one to grow marijuana. So it doesn't really make sense. It's a legal fiction in a way, where we are allowing people to some degree avoid the criminal penalties of possessing it, but we're saying you can't buy it, you can't sell it, you can't grow it. And so we're turning a blind eye to the black market while simultaneously saying, you're going to continue to have the police interactions that we're going to do. We're going to continue to enforce these laws and spend money towards it, but we're not going to reap any economic benefit from it. So I think it's not even a half solution. But I will say this, that come November 3rd, if we haven't aligned on legalization legislation that effective immediately creates a decriminalization pathway, we're going to continue to have arrests on November 4th, and that's a real problem. So we need to do something to secure, at the very least, deprioritization of cannabis arrests, so that police aren't out there making arrests when there are industry folks coming together to figure out what this industry looks like.
Thank you. And I would like to recognize that I am starting to see some questions coming in from the audience. So I'd like to turn to that soon, and I will. And none of this has been rehearsed. I'm very proud of this panel. I have not shared the questions with them in advance of this discussion.
That is true.
So some of it is a little bit of a curveball, and I'd really like to exercise my moderator prerogative to throw an additional curveball. And this is try to, maybe limit your response to a minute or so, but I'd love everyone to answer this question. What's your counterintuitive, half crazy prediction about the next 3 to 5 years in our industry?
I'll go. Offshore importation of raw product. I mean, I think ultimately, and I counsel clients about this all the time, I think the grow, particularly when we see adult use approved at the federal level, and I do think we might see that in the next 3 to 5 years, I think you're going to see offshore growing. I think we're going to see importation like we import pineapples and kiwi fruits and the like. And I think you're going to see this at a importation effort. And I think you'll see a lot more product development. And then the other side of the coin, I think you're also going to see, like we see in the beer world, this unbelievable explosion of micro brews. I think you're going to see a craft cannabis space explode in that world. I think you're going to see large, the Coors Lights and the Budweisers of marijuana. And I think you're going to see craft cannabis really start to take shape here, and that be really the future of the innovative cannabis space in America.
Thank you. Who wants to jump in next?
I'll jump in, and you are darn right, moderator. We did not see that one coming. So counterintuitive, I'm going to pick up on that.
It's going to just be intuitive.
Because what's happening with the FDA right now, and its demand for data, and its focus on research that produces data, that will support more research, that will ultimately support the claims that cannabis brands are trying to make. Some of them are improperly making now. I think, as frustrating as this period of time that we're in right now, where FDA is still enforcing rules and regulations that are somewhat unclear, their focus on data will have a positive result in the fuller value of this plant as a medicine. I'm winging this here, so this wasn't like, this is not rehearsed. These are just some insights. In a similar way, and this is why I encourage brands right now, wherever we are in the state of legalization, wherever you are on the product life cycle, whether you're a concept, whether you're at revenue, whether you're early stage, mid stage, this is the time to be focusing on your brand and creating commercial strategies that are compliant, that start to establish revenue. Here's why. Because I think in 5 years, if not less, pharma will come in, and they already are. They're just waiting. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just an observation. And they will become a massive player in this market. So brands need not wait, because there's enough guidance today to help you to get your product in a reasonably responsible way on the market. But now would be a time to double down. Get your position players in place, get your processes and procedures in place, and take your mark in this industry.
Thanks. Dan, what's in your crystal ball?
So intuitively, what's in my crystal ball, I suppose, would be a thriving industry, like along the lines that Bill was saying. You know, a lot of those craft cannabis will be small businesses. Dispensaries will be very easy to locate. There'll be lots of dispensaries. I think it'd be really funny if like seniors got into it and then like everybody hates it. So like if the whole adult market were ruined by the perception that only old people like it, as if it were like an old tea or like a cough drop, that would be like really funny. That would be counterintuitive in terms of that.
Very good.
So.
Very good. And Amol, really interested in hearing your perspective. Where do you see the industry 3 to 5 years from now?
So I'll talk about both industry and culture. So 2 things. One is that we're going to, maybe 3 things. We're going to see economic opportunities for people that were carved out of economic society before. You know, we're going to have a whole generation of folks who are going to, if we do this right, who are going to get their records cleared. And therefore be able to participate in any economic opportunity, not just the cannabis industry. We're talking about any job that they were prohibited from doing before. Secondly, I think we're going to reduce the stigma. We're going to, proactively make sure that people are no longer thinking about cannabis the way we've learned in schools throughout the 80s and 90s in American society about how it's a gateway drug. Where there are people in New Jersey, even though we're having these very sophisticated conversations and the governor's campaigning on it and the assembly speaker and the Senate president are supporting it, there are still people in New Jersey that repeat the same myths and the tired and rhetoric around gateway drugs. So we're going to reduce the stigma. Thirdly, I think we have an opportunity here, if we do it right, to fundamentally change policing. Because one of the biggest reasons why people get stopped is the smell of marijuana. One of the biggest reasons why people, it's a pretext for searches and stops and frisks. And if we do the legislation right and remove that tool from police to no longer be able to say that, the smell of marijuana leads to probable cause and I therefore get to detain you or search you or something to that effect, then I think we're going to fundamentally change the way police community interactions happen in New Jersey and in American society more broadly.
Very good. And I've been watching the Q&As and the chats, and I've been trying to weave in some of the common themes to this discussion, but there is an additional question that we have not addressed yet, and I'd like to turn to Bill for this. This is about home grow. When we think about home grow, how important is that, and how do we weave that into the larger legislative matrix as we try to solve for so many things in this industry. Where does home grow sit in that rubric?
It's in the horizon, and we should break some news here for folks that are interested in what's going to happen in New Jersey. Get interested now. The bill is being drafted literally as we speak, and the footprint of that bill is the bill that was moving through the legislature when it stalled a year ago last spring. What has happened with that legislation is they've stripped out all of the components that were adopted in the Jake Honig Act. Jake Honig, the young boy that died tragically from a brain tumor and was treated with cannabis. They named the bill after him, but that was the medical bill. Those provisions in the combined bill have been stripped out now. They're going to look at the main crux of that legislation and then add into it and where it goes. Home grow was a missing component to that. I think, and again, we've talked about this, Amol hit on this culture change. And I think one of the reasons why this culture change is happening now is people are becoming more educated about this. They're still a little scared. When they hear about home grow, they think about, somebody taking their backyard and turning it into like a plot of, like a cornfield of marijuana. That's not what we're talking about. And frankly, most of it will be indoors. You won't even know. The reason why home grow isn't included, and it is not the dirty industry, and it's not a massive lobbying campaign, it is confusion. And we said we're going to take the best of laws and the worst of, and stay away from the worst of laws. Well, New Jersey, a couple of years ago, the main folks that were involved in it at that time at the legislative level driving this took a trip to Colorado and said, tell us everything. And we're like, this is incredible. We like it. We met with regulators at the local level who, town code officials who are like, we're writing all the rules as we go. We love it. We're working with these crazy scientists in the industry, and we're adopting code on, extraction processes for all of this. It was a really exciting time. The one thing they said when we were there is, don't do what we did in regard to home grow. Now, the problem here is Colorado didn't do home grow. Colorado did something far beyond home grow. They did the co-op model. And so it's not just Bill Caruso being allowed to grow some plants in my house. It was Bill Caruso being able to grow plants for my grandmother, who's also sick and can't grow. And then her friend who lives down the hall in the nursing home. And then their other friends. And then next thing we know, you're growing for a dozen to 2 dozen people in a warehouse. And that looks a lot more like a commercial operation. Colorado allowed that, and it became a disaster to regulate. So Jersey really never heard that part of the message. I still do think that there is an opening for advocates, and the advocates have been doing a masterful job on this, to push for a small component to allow home grow as a part of this. But even if we don't get it, we're not done here. This is the full employment for the Legislature Act as well. You will see modifications to this law as we go. The legislature is going to continue to adopt it. So I think this is the time to start lobbying for home grow. But if we don't get it in this version, we keep going. I think it will happen.
Very good. And Amol just had to jump, but I wanted to thank him personally for his time. I wanted to thank the whole panel. I can't believe that we're at the hour. It's up already. So Bill, thank you. Dan, thank you. Sheri, thank you. And I'd like to turn it back to Jill and or Christina for some parting thoughts.
Yeah,
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Gary.
Sure.
That was amazing. Just so inspiring, so insightful. Loved all the information. Such an amazing panel. Gary did a great job. Thank you again. We hopefully, most of us will be able to join the NJCAN 2020 event that's happening right now at 6 o'clock. Again, let me just thank our partners, Heady, New Jersey, The Last Prisoner Project, Garden State Normal, Cannabis Voters Project, Tribe Tokes, and Theramu. And I'm going to close it out with a song from Wiz Khalifa, I Get
Great.
Lifted. DJ Jazzy Jill in the house.
Thank you all. It was a
Thank you
pleasure.
again, everybody. This
Pleasure and an
recording
honor.
will
Thank
be
you.
added to our Emerald YouTube channel, so keep a lookout. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Feel free to
everyone.
reach out.
Counselor, Warren
I'm just soaking up this breeze.
smoking on some trees.
Smoking on this weed, this is all I need.
Smoking on this weed, this is all I need.
Smoking on this weed, this is all I need.